In this video, I'm going to show you the first boss of my Metroidvania game. This boss appears at the end of the tutorial level, so it has to be relatively easy to defeat since the player is still becoming familiar with the combat, but still, it needs to present at least some level of challenge so that the fight wouldn't be boring. Welcome to Devlog 3 of Cloverskar, a Metroidvania game I'm currently working on. If you find this game interesting, you can show support by adding it to your wishlist on Steam. My main goal with this boss was to introduce the player to a kind of combat that's a little bit more serious than just shooting ladybugs. But since all the enemies that come before this boss are very easy to defeat, I wanted to keep the boss fight fairly simple. So this boss is kind of like a teaser for all the upcoming bosses in the game. Since the game is only just starting at this point, I made sure that there was a save point right before the boss fight, so that if you don't defeat the boss on your first try, you don't have to walk too far to try again. The boss has some basic attacks which most Metroidvania players will recognize, so I don't think anyone's gonna have too much trouble getting over this fight. I do realize that this is a risky decision for a game like this, since I'm going to sacrifice some originality in order to have a more approachable difficulty curve. But I think ultimately it's going to be a good idea to let the player slowly become familiar with the combat. First of all, I'd like to explain how I approach basic enemy design, since that'll make it easier to later explain the boss. In video games, enemies can be defined as obstacles in the player's progression with multiple behaviors depending on the player's actions. For example, an enemy could have an idle behavior, a chase behavior, and an attack behavior. So to create an enemy, we need to define these states and transitions between them. Probably the most common way of handling transitions between enemy behaviors is by using the distance between the player and the enemy. So if the player is far away, the enemy is idle. If the player is within aggro distance, the enemy chases the player, and when the enemy gets close enough, it goes into the attack behavior. One mistake I made early in the development is that I tried to put the code for all of these behaviors in one script. In this approach, you might have some variable to act as a marker for which behavior is currently active, and then you can execute a different code depending on the value of that variable. This approach does work, but as you might imagine, the code gets very long very quickly. What I did to fix this is I switched to a state machine system. For those of you who use Unity, you might have come across a similar system if you've used the animator window, because it works pretty much in the exact same way. So basically, just like the animation can go from the idle state to a walk state, the enemy state machine can do the same between idle, aggro, attack, or any other states defined as enemy behaviors. This makes the code much cleaner, because in the enemy script, I just need a reference to a state machine, and then I can get whichever state is currently active and read the behavior from there. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification, but I don't want to bore you with the details in this video. Let me know if you'd like to see a different video on enemy state machines where I give a more in-depth explanation. Now, when it comes to the boss, it works in pretty much the same way, but since the player and the boss are always going to be close to each other in the same room, the distance between them doesn't play a role in deciding which behavior the boss is going to choose. Instead, the boss is always performing attacks with a couple of seconds of idle time in between. One exception is this attack where the boss flies into a wall and becomes stunned. The stun effect lasts around 5 seconds, but if the player attacks the boss, the stun effect goes away and the attacks continue. I made it so that it's possible for the boss to either pick attacks at random, or to have a defined chain of attacks which are going to loop. For this boss, I chose the second option since this is the first level and I want it to be easier for the player to learn the attack patterns. The first boss is going to be where the player is going to get the first ability. Once the boss is defeated, this red crystal is dropped, which can be shot with an arrow. This breaks the crystal and gives the player the first ability, Glide. If you've seen the first devlog of this game, you might remember I briefly showed this ability, but since then I've completely changed how the ability looks. Instead of red wings, I now made these clovers swirling around the player, and I've named the ability Clover Walk, since I thought that would go a little bit better with the theme of the game. What this upgrade does is it simply lowers the player's maximum fall speed while the jump button is held while the player is in the air. I've actually added multiple new abilities since then, but I'm gonna talk more about that in the next devlog, so if you don't want to miss that, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I'd like to now go into a bit more detail about how the boss attacks actually work. So I wanted to minimize the amount of code I'd need to write for this boss to work, so I relied heavily on animation events. In Unity, in the animation window, you can click this little white button, which will add an event that's going to be triggered in the selected keyframe. In the inspector, you can then select the method that's going to be triggered by this event. As you can see, on my boss object, I have a bunch of methods which are being handled by the animation. This makes the code much cleaner and easier to maintain. So for example, in this attack, I have these 3 keyframes where the boss should fire some projectiles. So when the animation is playing and it gets to these frames, the event gets triggered and the attack happens. So that's pretty much it when it comes to my first boss. In the next devlog, I'm probably gonna talk about the other player abilities I've implemented so far. By the way, if you'd like to show some support, consider adding Cloverskar to your wishlist on Steam. The link will be in the description. Thanks.